All right, we are live. Welcome to another episode of the Athletic Transformation Project podcast. I am here with my friend Gregg Pignataro, the kind of owner operator of Never Past Your Prime. Gregg's got a really interesting story. Former Division One soccer player, had a lot of injury setbacks that he's had to kind of go through, deal with, overcome. Has gotten back to being someone who's still athletic and fit and doing things kind of later into like past his traditional athletic prime. Someone has a world record in Nordic curls, so a lot of interesting stuff to kind of get into and unpack today. So, Gregg, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, Zach, thanks for having me, man. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. Like we were talking about before, like Gregg's another someone who's been in the ATG community for a long time. So we've both been in there for a couple of years now. So definitely long overdue to actually connect and get to know your story a little bit and what you're doing now. So looking forward to it.
For sure. Me too.
So let's get into your kind of your soccer background and stuff like that in particular, because I know that's a big part of like kind of who you were and who you do now, like having to overcome some of the setbacks. So you've got really cool stuff about your story on your website and that sort of thing. But for people that don't know, if you want to give us maybe the overview of kind of what that process was like, what you went through to get to where you are now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like with many kids, I had a huge dream of being a Division One athlete, maybe even a pro athlete when I was younger. And soccer was always my sport of choice, to the point where I didn't even really play any other sports. I know that was somewhat uncommon, and in hindsight, I wish I had. Maybe I would have been a little more well-rounded athletically, but it was just all soccer all the time. And I eventually did get to realize that dream. I got to play soccer at Marquette University, and really quickly I found the transition to Division One to be a little bit more than I had bargained for. Athletically, tactically, like physically, all of it was kind of just a step too high at first, and I felt and so very challenging. It was maybe the only thing I had to lean on was my level of fitness. Like I was still one of the, I was one of the fitter guys on the team, but in terms of playing that freshman year, I was nowhere near getting time on the field. And so that was very difficult from an ego standpoint, because, I had built this whole identity around like, oh, I'm this great soccer player. I'm getting to go to a Division One school. And then you get there and you're faced daily with evidence that like, oh, maybe you're not as good as you thought you were. And that can be really difficult to handle, and it was for me. And so what I realized years later, I was probably suffering from some imposter syndrome, like feeling I wasn't quite good enough to be there. And a really low point came about halfway through my freshman season, when the difficulty had just gotten to be too much. And I remember I had this very defeated thought pop into my head that said something like, man, those guys who are injured are lucky because they get to miss practice.
Wow.
And so, in a very powerful example of be careful what you wish for, the very next practice, nobody within 10 feet of me, I just made a routine pass with the inside of my foot, regular instep pass. And on the landing, I tore the arch of my left foot. And
Wow.
yeah, and had to miss the remainder of that season. And so I remember reflecting on it at the time, being like, I never want to feel that low and that helpless ever again. Like if I feel it, because my mind had given up, was looking for a way out, but didn't want to quit. And so I got injured instead. But the positive side of that was I said, okay, never want to feel that way again. Going to take control of the situation, going to work my butt off, going to do everything I possibly can. And so when I came back, never quite felt that way ever again. My freshman spring season, we got in the weight room for the first time, for the first time in my life, added about 15 pounds of muscle, saw some athletic improvements, and was like, okay, there's something to this strength training side of things. And so I resolved to, come back, redshirted my freshman year. I was like, I still have 4 years of my career ahead of me. Let's see where we can go next year. And next year was humming along just fine. Still wasn't playing very much, but the guy who was ahead of me was a senior, so I wasn't too worried about that. I knew it was the spring season was kind of the time for me to fight for my position. And toward the end of the fall season there, went up for a header, during practice with somebody who I probably had no business challenging in the air because he was bigger and better than me. And when we collided, my spine was twisted and I landed on the ground on my tailbone and got two fractures in my L5 vertebrae. So basically broke my back in two places.
Gee.
And that was an incredibly long recovery period. It ended my career at that school. I knew there was no coming back from that. So there was a 6 to 9 month rehab process before I was able to play again. And then I ended up transferring to a smaller, like a top 25 Division III school called Carthage College, and finished out my soccer career from there, and had a blast. But the big like lesson through all this and all the takeaways were I got to see some very powerful examples of like the need for mental strength when faced with challenges, and then got to really see the importance of preparing the body and taking good care of it. And I learned so much through my rehab process from the broken back. That was how I eventually came to pursue this as a career.
Yeah, that's so much. That's very, very interesting, dude. I didn't know all of those details. I do want to get into some of the stuff about the broken back, but first, something we're
Absolutely.
talking about with the almost like the connection of like the mind giving up, like almost like that wishing you were hurt and literally the next day, like running into
Yep.
that, like that's so so interesting. That's super powerful. I'm just wondering too, like how you got back. So before the back injury, like how you got out of that place, because I know that can be a very common place that athletes can get to. I went there when I was in college and broke my ankle. I had a very similar experience. A lot
Damn.
of the athletes that I work with coming off of ACLs, like so a lot of times the hardest part has nothing to do with the body and more of just that feeling isolated, that feeling alone, feeling like you've lost that identity piece, like you talked about. So more of like very easy to understand how you got there, but I guess more curious of how you got out of that place and kind of got back to getting on the field and, like you said, never feeling like that again.
So it was such an ugly feeling, like I was torn between like, this was the thing that I had wanted my entire life. Now that I got here, it was harder than I thought it was going to be. And it was so like that it was so bad, but I couldn't bring myself to quit. Like there was no way I could have done that. And so the only other the only other way out was essentially ended up hurt. And so when I was feeling that, like when I was injured and I knew like deep down, I don't know if at the time I would have said like, it could have said exactly why it happened, but it definitely, or not like I caused it with my mind, maybe could have been a step too far, but it was still like that very stark, careful what you wish for moment. And when I was considering it, part of me was like, at least some of you wanted this, like you wanted a way out. And like I said, that was just so uncomfortable to feel that and realize about myself that I had given up without giving up on something that was a dream for a long time, that it kind of flicked a switch and was like, never again. Like, don't feel that way ever again. So, and that's probably not the same for everybody. Like, there are people who wouldn't have gotten to that point, or people who would have experienced something similar and that wouldn't have been enough to shift the mindset. So I can't necessarily give a formula for how to recreate that, but I can definitely say for me, it was enough. And it was put to an immediate challenge because when I was healed at the end of my, my player end of season meeting with the coaches, they were like, we're going to cut you some slack because you're a freshman and you were injured. And I think it's because my grades were decent. But they were like, if your spring season goes the same way your fall season does, there won't be a roster spot for you on your sophomore season.
Wow.
So that was a ton of pressure to be in
Yeah.
an already fairly difficult situation. But that was probably what I was most proud of, even though in many ways my time at the Division I level could be considered a failure. During that spring season, I worked my butt off, and about halfway through, they were like, we've really seen a ton of improvement. Like your spot is secure for next year.
That's awesome.
So
That's awesome. So
yeah,
having that, like internal and that external kind of challenge both thrown down at the same time. Um,
yes,
that's interesting. It sounds like when you're talking about like that feeling of like what was like that driver to get back, it sounds like it was almost like a disgust thing. Like it's like a kind of self-disgust of almost like a disappointment in yourself of like having let yourself go that far and having it be much more of a like kind of negative, quote unquote, like emotional driver of like trying to run away from this thing that I very much don't like versus that like passion, big goal, like all of this like kind of stuff that you'll maybe hear is all around like social media is like your driver should be that like that big like nice passion like that airy fairy like that kind of stuff. Is that how it felt like? It was much more of maybe that kind of like a little bit of that darkness, a little bit of that like kind of negative fuel was what you were burning at least in the beginning.
Yeah, that was really well said. I completely agree. It you know, we talk about how, like, when you're a kid and your parent doesn't yell at you, but they say they're disappointed in you, and that's almost worse. Like,
Yeah.
it was definitely that. I was very disappointed in myself, and like I said, I had resolved, don't want to feel that again. It's too uncomfortable, too painful. So at first, that absolutely was a big part of the motivation. And I think it helped me get through some of the pain of rehabbing the injury or the struggle, because it was like, well, that's not worse than what I felt in that moment.
Mm. That's really, yeah, I think that's really interesting because like you had on the one hand you had the discipline and character to be like quitting's almost like not even an option. Like you're like, oh, it would be nice, but like more just like not allowing yourself to like holding that standard of like we're here, we've done this, like that's not something that's going to be an option. So how do I then have to get through this? And so having to go to more of like that darker place of like I will not, it's not like I'm trying to become this, but it's like I will not be this, like that kind of thing.
Totally.
I think that's something I've been thinking about a little bit more recently of just like starting to notice that or hear that be like a common thing among like successful people, whether it's in business or whether it's athletics and stuff like that. A lot of times like that first success or that first driver is much more of like that comes from like almost that negative place, quote unquote, like MJ getting cut from his high school team, like Tom
Yeah.
Brady being drafted sixth round, like all of that stuff of like, it's not that when they first started making it, like, it's not like they were trying to play to be the best of all time. Like they're trying to prove a point, almost like that screw you, like having that trying to prove who they were. And then once they got there, the motivation could maybe shift and be like, okay, now I'm playing for legacy. I'm playing for all of these things, but like, it's not what started and what got them going. And so that's just something I've been thinking about a lot being like younger myself, more in like that journey of like you're always trying to find your purpose, find that passion, all this stuff.
Yeah.
And Alex Hormozy is someone I've heard eloquent or like put it very eloquently, like if his when he's talking about starting out, like his goal in the beginning was just to like as a business guy, like not be broke. Like it wasn't
Yeah.
like "Oh, I have this big dream to accomplish. It's like make something of yourself, like get out of this spot that you really don't like. And then when you get a certain point, maybe that will shift into more of like a positive motivation. But that's been something that's been kind of liberating for me a little bit of like, you don't have to have this big, beautiful purpose and all that stuff necessarily like in the very beginning. You can burn a little bit more of like that other kind of fuel. So that's just something I've been thinking about. So I just wanted to kind of illustrate or like touch on that point a little bit.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, because what we can't necessarily control what motivates us. And if we create a story that says, I shouldn't be motivated by this thing at this time, I should be motivated by something else, that can hold us back. And then also on the flip side, like you alluded to, it is totally fine. I'd argue even ideal for your motivation to shift at certain points. And so like the playing for the reason of like, oh, MJ got cut from the varsity basketball team, always like having that in the back of his mind as like a tool to be able to use or tap into, but not needing it for success. Like as he got more and more success, I'd say is probably the ideal way to operate. That you have this set of motivations that you can tap into based on what the situation calls for.
Yeah, I mean, I know I think Jordan Peterson talks about that, like with his self-authoring program and stuff like that. Like it's creating the like it's like carrot and stick, like something that you
Yeah,
want to like avoid and run away from, as well as having something that you want to run towards. And I just think it's like especially when you're younger, it can be harder to know exactly what that thing you're running towards is. And so that can be a little bit
definitely.
disheartening or a little bit challenging, but like it's usually a lot easier to know what you want to run away from. And I think like to your point, like having just being okay with that story piece of like it's okay to use some of this, like whether it's anger, whether it's sadness or something, like if you have that like inside of you, like it's okay to use that. It's like we're very big, I guess, in society now of like you shouldn't feel these things, and so like everything should be like a lot of the affirmations and that sort of stuff. And I think there's something to that for sure, not to discredit it entirely, but like if that's there, if that's inside of you, like getting that behind you where it can push you forward and be something that you can use, I do think is something that's big, something that's interesting. So yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, I completely agree. And having that balance, right? Like you said, like not discounting the positivity and the affirmations, but also I think we can go to too dark a place sometimes if we refuse to feel those negative things. If we
Exactly.
like try to get rid of them and only block them out and never embrace them and feel them, that's not ideal either. So yeah,
Yeah,
I
that's when
totally
they come
agree with
out
you.
and that's when they come out in negative ways instead of like positive
Hmm.
ways. So it's like using the
Definitely.
negative to create a positive. So then when we get into like the second one, then like breaking your back, like what was that process like? That I'm almost interested in, like the actual physical recovery as well. And then something like obviously you get made it back to playing and doing all of those things. So what was that process like? What was the recovery like? Was this stuff you were doing on your own? Was this stuff all with like a guided physio? Like, and then how did that, I guess, shape into what you're doing now? And so a lot of the stuff that you've worked with your own clients.
Yeah. So the hardest part by far was I think it was for the first 3 or 4 months, I wasn't allowed to do anything. Like I wasn't allowed to ride on the bike. I wasn't allowed to do push-ups. Like I would they said like your exercise is walking. Like that's what you can do. But nothing else. So that was very difficult to overnight go from the demands of being a Division 1 athlete to now like you can walk and that's it. So that was really challenging, mentally and physically. Also lost some of that muscle I'd put on and was stuck in a Milwaukee winter. So that was a cold, rough one for a little while. And then I was lucky enough um, to go through physical therapy with a good team there. Like they had a lot of connections to the team that worked with the Milwaukee Bucks, being in the same city. So I got to work with some very talented physical therapists, and it was a lot of mobility work that like if you're in this field now, like it sounds simple, like doing a lot of hip mobility, a lot of glute strengthening, a lot of core work, like all that stuff that is pretty par for the course. But for me at the time, I hadn't really experienced much of it. So you know thinking, oh, some of this is fairly basic, maybe this isn't like that difficult, but sticking with it, and within a few months of coming back feeling better than I had prior to the injury, like that was very eye-opening. It was like, wow, okay, so not only did I heal, I worked on some weaknesses I probably didn't even know I had. And that this can be incredibly important. So that showed me not to neglect the quote unquote boring stuff or easy stuff or simple stuff. Some of the things that were like, oh, I'm a high level athlete, I'm too good for this hip rotation exercise. But it's like, nope, you're not. You probably need it more than most.
I was gonna say, right? The best ones are always the ones that need the basic stuff the most. Like
Totally.
that's really cool though. That's very interesting of like from that first experience of planting that idea, or almost like the expectation, like that now you can not only is it an expectation just to come back, but to come back better. That's something that I'm really, really big and touching on with all of my athletes. It's something that I try and push back a lot because you see a lot of the idea coming from just the medical staff, medical industry. Like I'll talk to so many people. It's like, oh, my doctor said I'll never do this again. I'll never do this again. If I get to 80%, it's a win. And like I get where they're coming from, trying to like manage expectations, different things like that. But to me, that's something that's super disheartening, something that I try and push against like as much as we can. Like our goal, all of the stuff that we do when we're working with athletes coming off of ACL, whatever it is to get back. Like our 100% is like a baseline. That's like a minimum of where we need to get
Yep.
to. But like to get back to 110, to get back to 120, like to get back to doing things that we could never do before. That's something that I really try and instill with everybody that we work with, and maybe give them that belief very, very early on. So that's something that's super cool that you got from that, because I definitely think a lot of athletes maybe don't get that in their PT experience coming back from whatever injury it is that they're going on. So is that something that maybe like kind of set the tone for then how you now do stuff like later on and kind of raise the bar for what your goals and expectations can be for the people that you work with?
100%. And I think it's really admirable that you approach that because, if you tell an 18, 19, 20-year-old kid as a doctor, like, you're never going to be the same after this, a lot of them are going to believe you. And then that's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's also going to influence how much effort you put towards your rehab, you know? So even if it requires like being a bit naive to think like, oh, I could come back from this debilitating injury better than I am. I do strongly believe that, and I always encourage people to think that way because getting into some of the more ATG focused stuff now, like what we know now about the ability to actually strengthen tendons and ligaments and make them better through exercise, it seems silly to me to think that you couldn't come back better than you were in almost all cases because the body's ability to adapt is incredible. So
Yeah.
we shouldn't impose these artificial time frames on it, especially when we're talking about like high school and college athletes who are in their physical prime in terms of their ability to heal and grow. So there's no, I don't think there's any rational reason that we shouldn't at least be open to the idea that you can come back better than you were, and then see where it goes from there. And so this has definitely influenced how I approach things with my clients. So like I said, one of my favorite clients, well, they're all my favorite clients, sorry, but the one of the guys who I work with is 80 years old. He can do full push-ups to the floor, like he does the sled with over 100 pounds. Like we're working on getting him to pull-ups. Like, if you look at him compared to the average 80-year-old person, it's night and day of what he's capable of. But the main thing is that, and this isn't somebody who was an athlete when he was younger. Like he didn't get into strength training and whatnot until he was in his 30s and 40s, but stayed really consistent with it. Or another one of my a woman who I work with is going to turn 60 this year, and at our last session, she cranked out 7 Nordic curls.
Damn.
So yeah, so it's like I love challenging the idea of what we can do as we age. I think particularly in the West, we have way too limited a belief of that, and there were 2 big things that influenced my thinking on this front. The first gym I worked at when I moved to Phoenix was owned by a guy who was in his early 70s, and he was in phenomenal shape. And he said, really, the only difference as you get older is how long it takes you to recover between sessions. He said, you can still hold on to a vast majority of your physical capabilities. You just need to be extra diligent with the rest and recovery. And then a talk that I listened to for one of my continuing education events a few years ago was a guy who had worked with the Chinese Olympic teams. And he said in China, it's very common for people in their 60s and 70s to stay super active. And they have these, what they call mobility parks, where people who are retired come and do low-level gymnastics and mobility exercises like after their morning walk. And that's just like a thing that they do there. And it's, I think we would benefit quite a bit from shifting our mindset to like, that's what's expected of you when you retire, not to just like sit on your porch or play bingo or do whatever, like be completely sedentary.
Yeah, and I like how you phrased it too, of like being open to the idea that like some of these like greater results are at least possible, because like with anything, there's no guarantees and stuff like that. Like different people respond to different stuff differently, and like that will be our goal. But just not to have like to set the bar so low with some of like the expectations. I do think, like you said, it gets people to play down to that rather than to play up to
Totally.
that. So that's massive. With the PT that you did there, then like is that something that they deliberately tried to instill in you, or is that just more of like it came as a outcome, like at the end you're like, oh look, I can do this, and like, or is that something they were deliberately like, this is something that we want you to be able to do?
Yeah, man, that was almost 15 years ago, so my memory's a little
Come on, you haven't taken notes? I want
uh,
to.
a little fuzzy on that front. But what I do remember was the doctor who I worked with. He said like what's going to look like on when we did a follow-up scan, it showed that one side hadn't fully healed. Like there was still like Still looked like there was a stress fracture line, even though the pain was gone and my function was back. And he said, like, just because the imaging looks like it hasn't quote unquote fully healed doesn't mean at all that this needs to affect your performance. He said that's common with this type of injury, but there are people who completely overcome it and can play pain-free and do everything they could. So in a way, I was really lucky that I had a doctor like him and not one who's like, yeah, well, you should be pretty satisfied with 80%. That was a severe injury.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So how did you get from there to then a couple of years ago, is it just recently actually, to setting a world record in the most Nordic curls in 60 seconds? How did we get from broken back to Guinness Book of World Record holder?
Yeah, well, it actually still is interestingly tied to my college soccer story because in one of our first preseason workouts in my freshman year with the whole team, they wanted us to do Nordic curls, like partner Nordic curls, like a guy pushing down on your ankles, like that kind of thing. And between a roster of 30 guys, we had one player who could do one, and nobody else could do a single one. And and so they abandoned that, us having that exercise. They're like, no, this is too hard. They can't do it. um, and I kind of forgotten about Nordic curls mostly for years until like a couple of my friends started talking to me like, hey, you should check out this knees over toes guy. He's got some really interesting stuff. And one of his first videos that I saw, his plan for teaching Nordic curls with the, regressed range of motion, but still making sure to like do the movement was very compatible with how I would teach people to do push-ups if they couldn't. Like, we're skipping the knee push-ups. That's way too easy. Like, you could get to 50 of those and still not be able to do a regular push-up because there's no core, like not enough core involvement, etc. So I watched the video and was like, okay, maybe he and I have some similarities in terms of, how we approach progressing and regressing exercise. Signed up for the ATG Zero program, and within a month, like, my hip mobility was better than it probably had ever been. So I was like, okay, there's something to this system. Dove in and started working on Nordic curls hard, because in a way it was probably like some of the motivation could have been, okay, I couldn't do this thing when I was an 18-year-old Division I athlete. Now here I am in my early 30s. I'm going to conquer this thing that I couldn't do, and basically none of my teammates could do at the time earlier. So I'm going to set this challenge for myself. And it took me about 4 months of consistent effort to 4 months of consistent effort to get to my first Nordic curl. And then I kept training them once a week for about a year, built up to being able to do about 20. And around this time, I remember I watched that Tyreek Hill video. It was like he did 10. Actually, he did 9. Can't believe nobody called it out in the comments. But and he did a very challenging version, which I can get to in a minute because I've really nerded out on these. But basically, I started looking around. I was like, what is the world record for this? And everything I could find was basically like unofficial. And the most I could find was like 17 or 18. And the way Guinness does things in order to resolve disputes about like rest time and what counts as in a row, because that's kind of difficult to determine, is that it's all time period based. So their categories are most in a minute, most in 3 minutes, most in an hour, and most in a day. Those are the things that you can.
Most in an hour. Oh my God.
Yeah. So I was like, yeah, you know what? I'm gonna go for this. And in December of last year of 2022, Guinness made it official. So for anybody watching this, 24 reps in a minute is the number to beat. I think it can definitely. I think 30 is probably the theoretical max.
Yeah,
That's
wow.
gonna be
So
my guess. So
one every 2 seconds per second.
yeah, that's my
Wow,
guess.
that's
So
yeah, okay.
So someone out there gonna beat it.
Got you. All right, probably be you.
Maybe.
So I am very interested in that idea that you talked about of comparing yourself now, like athletically, to who you were like as that Division I 18-year-old college athlete, because that's something that I've looked at as well with my own training. Like my my freshman year of college, I ran a 5.2 40-yard dash, like as like a legit like college athlete, college soccer player, like so not exactly setting any land speed records.
Yeah.
And like it's been since getting into all the ATG stuff, doing different stuff, like I've gotten that down to a 4.6. Like that was several
Damn,
years ago.
dude.
I imagine I'm probably leaving a little bit faster now. I'd like to see if I could get into like the 4 or 5. So like getting past my like quote unquote prime and stuff like that, like when I'm actually a competing like athlete, and to now be more athletic than when I was then, like that's something that is kind of reaffirming, I guess, for me in terms of like the actual training and stuff like that we're doing. And so I'm curious for you if that's something that you've seen as well, like being someone now who can do 24 Nordic curls after not being able to do one, like what has that shown up, like what's that translated to like in terms of athleticism and things like that?
Yeah. So I definitely, I wish I'd gotten some more data on like miles per hour when I was younger. But at this point, like I know if my 19-year-old self and my 33-year-old self raced, like I'd smoke him. In
That's
part two,
wild.
just
Yeah.
in part two, just because like my technique is much better now as well. And in addition to the higher levels of strength. And so I can even just see it like on the field in terms of like my ability to change direction quickly. Like I feel better playing now than I did in college because I was always like battling minor injuries, like doing this and that. So that's one of my plans for this year, when it comes to it, particularly the running and jumping, is getting some hard numbers and digging back through, um, comparing to what I know I could have done at the time. Because I think my best 40-yard dash as a college athlete was like a 4.9, so like not slow but not fast either by any means. And I think my vertical jump was something like 24 inches, so very mediocre. So by later this year, I'll have some hard data on how much that's improved.
I love it. I look forward to seeing what that looks like. And so
Absolutely.
what do you think are some of those like kind of KPIs, I guess, that have translated into feeling stronger, feeling sharper now, like obviously like the Nordics and that sort of thing? Like just because I'm trying to look for stuff that you feel like you can point to and be like, this helped me in this way. Because like there's a lot of people on the internet that will like bash like Nordic specifically of like, oh, it doesn't actually help you become more athletic. Like it's just like a party trick, whatever, whatever. So I'm just wondering, like from your personal experience, like what have you felt like has had some of that carryover? Has it been the strength? Has it been the mobility? Has it been specific like exercise selection? Because I think that's one of the unique things about ATG is that like that kind of exercise selection piece, not just like raw strength numbers. So I'm just curious on from your end what you think has translated to some of that carryover.
For me personally, the big three have been the Nordics, the ATG split squat, and the Poliquin step. Um, the with the I think I think it's inevitable that Nordics are going to become more and more mainstream accepted over the next few years. I think they're going to be seen as, my bold prediction is they're going to be seen as fundamental a movement as something like a squat or a deadlift or a pull up. Like this is just a basic human movement pattern that you need to be able to do. And I've got some content that I'm going to release soon on this that I'm excited about. If you look at Usain Bolt at his ground contact point, like as he's pushing off to his next stride, the hip, knee, and chest angle are basically identical to the bottom of a Nordic. And to me, it's no surprise that elite sprinters are some of the only people who can do Nordic curls without training them because they're used to exerting force with those muscles in that exact angle that it requires at the bottom. So I think when it comes to that exercise, there's some resistance out there like, oh, it's useless, it's just a party trick. Because there's a lot of barrier to entry to even be able to do one. And, speaking back to like what we talked about at the very beginning of an identity being challenged, if there's this exercise that you can't do a single rep of and you consider yourself a fit person, a strong person, someone who's into fitness, it's sometimes more uncomfortable to be like, oh, this is a weakness I have to work on, rather than you can just dismiss it outright and be like, eh. there's no data yet, which there is starting to become some studies and stuff too. But so I'm curious to see where that goes, but gotten a little off topic there. So yeah, Nordics for sure. ATG split squat with that, just I couldn't even get into that position with body weight only the first time I tried it. Like I wasn't even close. And I'm sure the same is true for many people. So I just think there's something so important about that ability to be able to express strength in lengthened positions. It's super powerful. And that whole concept of short and long range training, you need to be strong when the muscles are at their most lengthened and at their most shortened, was a big paradigm shift for me, because you can view any exercise through that lens, I think. So the split squat, improving there, the Poliquin step, like getting up to over body weight for reps for that exercise has been really important, because you feel so secure in these high velocity movements, and changing direction, being able to stop on a dime, like all of those things, when they're slightly off, like you can kind of feel creaky as an athlete, like, when you're not at your best. I'm sure we've all experienced that. And for the most part, getting strong at these exercises at these specific joint angles has eliminated that feeling, which is really cool.
It's such an interesting description of that, like that feeling secure, just like the chassis on a car, like everything's actually just dialed in for a change. And I think that's something that everyone can relate to, like feeling not that, like feeling the opposite of that, of feeling like, oh, this doesn't feel fantastic,
Yep.
or like not having
Yeah.
that.
Or like, oh, maybe I shouldn't quite do this movement. And then of course, inevitably the game is going to ask you to do it. And you're either going to put full force into it and get hurt, or maybe half-ass it and then also get hurt.
Yeah, yeah, no, I do think that's one of the biggest benefits of some of that long range stuff, and that is something that I want to get into. But while we're still on the topic of Nordics and clearly talking to the Nordic king of the world, I do want to get into. I'm curious on some of the specifics, some of the details of like technique and execution and stuff like that. Because like within the ATG system, we've got kind of three variations. There's like the eccentric only. There's the Marty St. Louis with like the kip on the way back up. And then
Yep.
there's like more of like the concentric only, or like the floating ones. And so I'm curious in terms of which ones you maybe use the most, like, or more specifically, I guess I'm interested in some of like the technique stuff, because I'm a little hesitant or skeptical still of some of these like really aggressive like kipping reps, some of the Marty St. Louis reps. And I think
Mhm.
that's where some of like the internet comes in and like kind of bashes on some of that. Um, and so you'll also see, so with like those big kipping reps, or people who are really struggling and just trying to like with even with the eccentric, I see a lot of like overextending of like the lumbar, the flaring of the rib cage, and they're just really using that lower back to try and
Totally.
contribute, compensate for work in the hamstrings. So like me specifically, when I'm doing these personally or working with my athletes, like I'm very deliberate about kind of getting the rib cage down, almost slightly rolling the shoulder, like just really trying to get rid of any of that compensation from the lower
For
back,
sure.
not letting the shoulders come up before the hips, just because just personally something about that feels and looks better to me, more right, I guess. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, on like the actual execution of it, what you're trying to get out of it, and what you think of maybe those like exploding like kipping reps.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing, I insist on having anybody who I work with on Nordics use band assistance around the chest first. And I tell them like almost we want to use too much, like where it feels like it's going to slingshot you back up, so that you can get used to the proper technique without those compensations, like you said. Because what goes hand in hand with this is that to regress the range of motion on the eccentric reps, we all kind of default to like, oh, I want to touch my chest to the bench. So I have people focus on touching their waist instead, like touching their hips, because if you reach with your hips, you're actually going to make your hamstrings do more work, because you're going to be getting less of that hinge. And so people tend not to do that. So they tend to hold the angle of they tend to hold the hip angle the same. And so I tell people like, you're allowed to have a small amount of hip hinge, like as long as your shoulders aren't dropping below your hips. Like you can have a small amount of hip hinge. What you can't do is have that angle increase throughout the rep. You have to keep it exactly the same throughout the entire movement. So that's one. With bands, I find it's hugely important because like this is, do you mind if I get all nerdy and technical for
By
a
all
second?
means, let's go. That's
Okay.
what we're here for.
So with the problem with the first time anybody like does Nordics, especially unassisted, and they're just going to face plant, is because when they get to that angle where the hamstrings are having to exert so much tension in that lengthened position, there's a specialized type of proprioceptor cell within the muscles and within the tendon, the tendon itself. This one that we're talking about is called GTOs. They send a signal to the brain that say, hey, shut this muscle down. Don't let any more fibers fire because we're going to rip off the bone if you do this. And so that's why, like, the first time somebody does a Nordic, it doesn't matter how hard they try in that angle, their brain literally won't let their hamstrings fire any harder. It's shutting the muscle down and you face plant. And I've found that progressing one's strength in that, at that joint angle that causes that reaction without bands is very, very slow. You have to kind of fight for it a centimeter at a time. And that can take weeks and months to see much progress. Whereas if you use band assistance, you're getting your body comfortable exerting force at that exact angle, just with less weight. And so that's led to quicker progress from what I've seen. So like I had a client who I worked with, he went from 0 Nordics to 10 Nordic curls in 5 months. And he wasn't anywhere close on his first one. Because like I said, you're fighting your nervous system on this, and your nervous system usually wins. So touching on what you said about the different styles too, like I've found, and where I think it's fairly indisputable that the hardest part of a Nordic curl is that moment when you transition from the eccentric to the concentric phase. And like you said, you see a lot of people, I don't want to say cheat it, but like skip that part by doing an eccentric rep, controlling most of it. Like maybe they free fall the last inch, then they pause at the bottom and explode up. And you like, there absolutely still benefits to it, but I think it was a lecture from Keegan Smith where he was talking about that transition part from eccentric to concentric, the amortization phase. That's where most injuries happen, and that's where the best athletes are the quickest. Like that transition is the shortest. And so I think if you skip that phase, you are doing yourself a disservice. And I think absolutely it should be a goal to be able to handle that phase smoothly, strongly, and easily. And so if you look at that video of Tyreek Hill doing those reps, like you notice his amortization phase is lightning. Like he is so powerful as he transitions from lowering to rising. It's really impressive to see. And getting into further into technique here, he's doing a version that is much more difficult because he has his ankles pressed down and his toes are completely pointed in plantar flexion. And the degree of difficulty in the Nordic is influenced by being on that scale from full plantar flexion to full dorsiflexion. So ideally, you actually want your ankles in dorsiflexion if your goal is to do the movement most effectively. And the reason why is because it's kind of like doing it without that would be kind of like saying, okay, I can't do pull-ups, but I'm going to try to learn 2-finger pull-ups first before I try to do a full grip. Like if you have your ankles in dorsiflexion, you engage the muscles of your feet. Your calves are at a position where they can assist with the movement, and both of those things to combine to allow your brain and nervous system to be comfortable unlocking more muscle fibers in the hamstrings. So what I've ended up doing lately is I put a set of dumbbells and the ATG Buddy wedges in between the foot plate of the Rogue Nordic bench that forces people's ankles into that dorsiflexed angle. And everybody instantly is like, wow, I feel so much stronger and I feel my hamstrings so much more. So
So with
That's
that,
my,
are you putting the dumbbell in the wedge? Like if this is my foot here, are you putting it behind it or are you putting it in front?
sorry, say that again.
So are you putting the wedge and the dumbbell, like if the plate is here, are you putting it between the foot and the plate, or are you putting it on the other side of the foot?
Yes. So it goes, so you have the foot plate at the back, and then you have the like soft pad where the Nordic bench is.
Yeah.
In that gap in between, I put a dumbbell down, usually like a 10 or 15 pounds, so that people can push with the ball of their foot off of the bar of the dumbbell, like off of the
Okay. Okay.
handle. And then if they want it to be even, like if they want even more ankle plantar flexion, then I will put the ATG Buddy wedge in between so that it keeps their foot in that dorsiflexed angle the entire time.
Got it. So you're putting it where they can push off of. It's not like it's on top of the foot. So you're almost like simulating bringing the plate closer to the foot.
Exactly. So ideally, some enterprising company out there will make a foot plate that is adjustable and that could also angle each way,
Ooh.
because it is a really cool progression that I've been experimenting with too. Is that once you nail regular Nordics and you're looking to like expand the difficulty, then you start going into more of a plantar flexed ankle
Mm.
angle to make it even more challenging. So like I
Yeah.
said, that's part of why, even though he quote unquote did only 9 reps, like Tyreek Hill's performance in that was so impressive because he was in full plantar flexion the entire time, which means you have no muscles of the feet to help you. The calves are tied up because they're already engaged in plantar flexion. So that is 100% hamstring. Um, I know
Yeah. You see
you
that
got
like
me excited on my favorite topic here, but like that's one of the other reasons why I feel Nordics are going to be such a fundamental movement, is because when you do them in, I think, the optimal way in ankle dorsiflexion, you get the feet, you get the calves, you get the hamstrings, you get the core. Like it's almost a full body exercise in disguise. So a
Yeah,
lot
I
of
do
bang for
think
your buck
there's
there.
yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I do think there's a lot of benefit that people will maybe write off or dismiss when they do them without the same like quality of execution or attention to detail to some of these little things. So they maybe don't see some of the benefits, or as much of the benefits. So then it's a little bit easier to write off as something that's more of a gimmick or not doesn't have as much carryover. To your point about like the hamstring activation, so you can see that with the hamstring curl. If you're doing a hamstring curl and you flex the toes up like dorsiflex, you're going to instantly feel stronger than if you point the toes, shut off the calf act like contribution, use a lot more
Totally.
hamstring, instantly gets much harder. So that makes a lot of sense. So a few things there too. You talked about like that short amortization phase. I'm interested for you because you're talking about progressing into more of like plantar flexion, pointing the toes, which I like a lot. I'm wondering, have you, because you talked about Tyreek being so fast out of the bottom, have you played with speed at all? Because one of the most impressive things that obviously I had this one athlete who like we worked with to get him to progress his Nordics quite a bit. He got very strong at them. And then we started doing some like some drop catch reps where like we literally had him throw
Yep.
himself down to try and rebound as quickly as he can. I posted a video of it like maybe a little
I
while
think I
ago,
saw that one.
and it blew my mind. Like he exploded out of the bottom without using the shoulders, like super clean, super strict.
Yep.
So that was where my head went of like, okay, once you can start doing 5, 10 reps, like there's probably diminishing returns to getting 15 and 20. So like, where do we
I
progress it from
agree.
there? And so like that's where I've gone is like that speed phase. I feel like that probably has a little bit more carryover to like the athletic side of things as well. Have you flirted with that
Absolutely.
line at all?
I have. I've played with those a little bit. They're tough. They are done a few of them. But yeah, no, I think it's a great progression. And like you said, because that is one of the interesting things about like, any movement, like the sports are executed at such high speed that I do think it's very beneficial to have that component in the weight room too, with the movements you're at. Like, yes, doing the incredibly slow eccentrics and pause reps at the bottom for various things in perfect form is incredibly important. But we also need that speed component too once those things are mastered. Otherwise, it's going to feel very different when you're executing on the field versus in the weight room. So yeah, I'm big fan of drop catch Nordics when people are ready for them, but I
Yes.
consider it a highly advanced exercise. And like you said, once you can do 10 reps, those progressions are probably where you want to go, because when somebody can do, say 10 pull-ups, it's going to be somewhat diminishing returns in terms of strength to get to 20. But if you start doing, if you start adding some weight, like you can really make some good adaptations.
I do think that's a very important caveat of like this is a very advanced move and stuff like that. Don't go trying to do those drop catch ones straight away because that's definitely like if you had to design a way to tear a hamstring, that's probably
That
that's
would be it.
probably so definitely be prepared for
That'd be
that.
it.
I do
Yeah.
think that's a good point too about like the translation from that slow eccentric strength. I think Ben Clarefield talks about it really, really well of like that slow strength, that eccentric strength, that's like capacity almost. Like that's your or that's
Mhm.
like potential in order to then express or translate some of
Yeah.
that power, that explosiveness. So going back a little bit to what we talked about with when you're talking about trying to get somebody into them for the first time. So we've gone like where does this go and you're really trying to have fun with it, where's the top end, but like that regression piece, I do think that can be something that, like you said, can be disheartening to people because it can feel like a very large barrier to entry. And it's the same with chin-ups, right? Like it's almost like if you can't do
Totally.
a single chin-up, like it can be disheartening to actually train or even challenging to actually train it because you're not strong enough to get an actual stimulus out of it where you're just training. If you can't do a single chin-up and you just like have like a little quarter rep, you're
Totally.
never going to actually get better at them because you're not good enough to train it. So that regression piece is something that I do think is massive. And so for you, you talked about your big one is using the band.
Yep.
I've used, so for me, the two ones that I've used a lot are like elevating the bench. That's probably the one that
Yep.
I use the most just because it's easier where I'm at. The setup is easier to do that
For
than
sure.
adding a band. I'm sure you've probably played with that as well. Another thing that I've used a lot of more in the last few months is I've started taking like an RX pad and putting that right in front of the knees. So, like they're not kneeling on it, but like if I'm here,
Hmm.
it's literally like almost like kissing. And that has helped a ton with, I don't know if you've run into this where people will go and they'll do their, and something like sometimes it can just feel weird in the knee, like something about that
Yep.
falling, whether it's just like getting pinched and stuck, like something, it will just not feel quite right for a lot of
Or
people.
like the patella kind of slips around a little bit.
Yeah,
Like I've
yeah, yeah,
had some.
yeah. And so like that RX pad has gotten rid of that instantly for people. It also serves as a little bit of a regression. It can help you just feel just a tiny bit
Yeah.
stronger, tiny bit smoother. So like I like it for both of those reasons. But that's something I've used a ton of with those that I've found to be very, very effective. That I've liked a lot. So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, no, I think that so I the elevating the front of the bench is a huge one. Like that one's great for sure. I tend to use like stackable foam pads because in addition to the bands, I also regress the range of motion. So I'm right there with you on that. And then with I'd experimented a lot with different amounts of padding for the knee because I don't you have the Rogue Nordic bench,
Yeah.
right?
Sore next one, the mini one.
Okay, got it. I haven't used the Sore Next one, but the Rogue one, like even though it's cushioned, like sometimes that can still feel fairly uncomfortable on the knees. But what I found once I once I implemented that like ankle dorsiflexion method with basically like an adjusted foot plate position, that went away. And I think it was because there's more overall total muscle engagement from the knee down, like between the calf and between the feet. So that like less force is actually going onto that point of contact with the joint to the pad itself. So that got rid of it for me and all but one of my clients. And that one who didn't like it, we just put a very thin foam pad under his knees to like increase the cushion. So like very similar to what you do.
That's interesting. That makes a lot of sense, and that's something I hadn't thought of. But I can get the idea behind that. If there's almost like there's more like tension in the system just throughout like the entire leg when you can get that anchored a little bit more, so it can feel better. There's less just like looseness that you're then compressing and stuff like
Totally.
that. That kind of makes sense. So
Yeah.
that
Or just, I mean, and then think about it with like a traditional squat too. If somebody's like, oh, like this feels uncomfortable on my knees or this feels uncomfortable on my back, it's like if you get them to breathe and brace properly, 99% of the time that goes away because the muscles and the soft tissue are doing their job rather than force going to the bone.
That's a very good point. Last Nordic question, and then
Yeah.
we'll move on from there. So for people that are just in like a regular gym or don't have access to the fun toys like the Nordic benches and stuff like that,
Yeah.
what's your go-to setup if you're just in like a Crunch or an LA Fitness?
I actually learned on a Smith machine because I
Yep.
didn't have a Nordic bench. So Smith machine, get one of those foam like hip thrust or squat rack pads for your ankles. Otherwise, that will be really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Um, then load up the bar with about 25% more than your body weight because your hamstrings can exert a lot more force than you think. And then I would kneel on a bench and I would do it horizontally rather than vertical so that I didn't have to keep my knees so close together. Um, so that that can mean you need to drag over like some steps or like a plyo box or something. So depending on, and if all you have is the bench, and then yes, you can do it vertically. But I've found for most people, it's more comfortable if your knees aren't forced to be so close together.
Gotcha. Yeah, I've used that exact same setup. I've just gone vertically instead of horizontally. But yeah, I do feel like for
Yeah.
people trying to do it at home, the Smith machine, it honestly works great. Like
Yeah.
it
Maybe the
works
best
quite
use
well.
for the Smith
Yeah.
machine.
Yeah, honestly, like one thing too, I even used, so like when I was coaching athletes through this and using the Smith machine, so like they had a partner basically. I would take one of those big, like the long like aerobic steps, like the little plastic guys that
Oh,
they
yeah.
the aerobic steppers on, and I would put that right up against their feet and lean against it. So it was even like
Nice.
a plate that they could push into. So like you
That's
obviously
awesome.
you need a partner for that. But just because that's the one thing that's missing from the Smith machine is like the foot plate. So
For
that was
sure.
the way too. Oh, and now like you talked about playing with the angles, you could do with that like
Totally. No,
a little
that's
bit
a great
too. Like,
idea. That's
very
awesome.
cool. Like, okay. So then getting back into the other big movements you talked about were like the ATG split squat and the effect that had on really drastically improving like hip mobility in particular in a very
Hmm.
short amount of time. But you also talked about during your like rehab for your back and stuff like that of like getting into more like traditional mobility stuff, hip mobility, different things, and like feeling like that had you improved quite a bit from that, but then you also feel like now you maybe kind of reached another level of that through the ATG stuff. Is that right? Like there's just talk to me about, I guess, like the differences between the two or like the levels that you reach with each of those.
Yeah. So now I basically see every mobility exercise as a strength exercise also, whereas like before I didn't. And so, loading these various positions, like these lengthened positions, basically teaches your brain and your nervous system, hey, it's safe to get into and out of these. We don't have to worry about this position. Because one thing that was a big eye opener for me was that I learned that when you're under anesthesia, even like the most unflexible person on the planet could do like a full pancake split. Like the signals from your nervous system to fire your muscles to restrict you from getting into these positions are off. So like you could be put into any position. Now that carries risk of dislocating something, which is part of why they strap you down when you're under anesthesia. But it does mean that like your range of motion on any given exercise is mostly a function of what your brain perceives as safe. And so you can change that. And using more than your body weight to get into and out of positions is a great way to show your brain that like, yeah, we don't have to worry about this position. We've got it. It's safe. And so one of the things that illustrated that is, so like if you look at the couch stretch compared to your traditional, stand on one leg quad stretch, like both are putting you into a similar degree of knee flexion, but in the standing quad stretch it's completely passive, like your arms are holding you there and your quads and your hip flexors have to exert very little force. Whereas in the couch stretch, your hip flexors and quads are doing quite a bit of work to keep your torso upright, like they're actually under load. And so when you can get into that position under load, now all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, this is safe. This is no problem. I can exert force here. I can get into and out of it. And that's much more translatable to other activities.
I do think that's one of the biggest things that people maybe from the outside looking in at some of the ATG movements are like seeing that like talking about strength through length and mobility who maybe have more of that mobility background be like, of course, like mobility is important. That's something that we do. We're very big on mobility, but I do think that there's a difference that maybe gets overlooked from people that don't maybe know the differences between the two of like that loading piece I do think is very underrated and very, very valuable for improving
Totally.
just the quality, like essentially it's a harder stimulus, right? Like on the as big as possible bird's eye view superficial level, like it's a more challenging stimulus for the body to then load and lengthen some of these positions. So it's a more challenging stimulus, you get a more powerful adaptation. And so that strength through length idea is, to your point, like you get a more powerful effect on the nervous system, like when you can actually move through some of these positions with still with control and not like kind of fighting that with like you're shortening up your breath and bracing and things like that. You do get that relaxation, that like safe communication to the brain and to the nervous system. And then I
For
also
sure.
think there's much more of that structural piece as well. I think that's the biggest difference. If we can create a structural adaptation to the actual tissues by pulling on them more, getting into this lengthened position, so that it's something that is not just purely a neurological stimulus where you can get that through a lot of passive stretching, where if you spend a long enough time there, you get that signal to the brain to relax, things will open up, but you don't create the structural change. You don't create a lot of that, like that permanent change as much, like which I think has probably been one of the biggest differences that I've seen through all the ATG stuff, is that the mobility gains that I have now and that our athletes have, like it sticks around a lot longer. You don't have to
Yes.
continually do this mobility routine like over and over and over
A
again.
hundred, a hundred
And
percent.
I think
Which is
that's
really, it's really cool because a lot of times I remember, when I was a young athlete, I resisted some of the mobility stuff because it was boring, and it felt ineffective because it'd be like, oh, like certainly, 2 hours later after stretching, let alone the next day, like all the additional range of motion you got is gone. But with the strength through length mobility piece, like now with no warm up, I can do like a full couch stretch or palms to floor hamstring stretch, because I see it as almost like you unlocked an ability in a video game. It's like your brain says, "Yep, this is yours now. You can do it," or you can do it with very minimal warm up, and it takes like maybe doing it once a week to maintain. And that's very motivating to say like this isn't something that's temporary. This is now an ability that I have and I can use whenever I need. So I think
100%.
that's a really, really powerfully motivating, particularly for young athletes.
And you get like that strength adaptation out of it, which I think has way more carryover to like the athletic or the injury prevention side of things. Like I think people will talk about well, you don't want to stretch, you don't want to improve mobility because you can potentially you can potentially hurt yourself. And like I think people overplay the relationship between the two of like if you stretch and then go and sprint, you're going to tear a hand. Like I don't think it's quite as aggressive as or as close to that as people will make it seem. But like with this, you get to create much more of that strength in these end range positions, and it's something that you then become a lot more. You're structurally sound as well as just capable of getting into these positions. So it's
Totally.
something that I think helps a lot with the athletic side of things, the injury prevention side of things, compared to just pure mobility, at least from what I've seen.
I completely agree.
Amazing, dude. So I do want to be mindful of your time and stuff like that. So I want to get into some of the stuff that you're doing now, some of the like the online coaching, the programming that you've taken all of these like experiences that we've gotten into with yourself personally and with coaching all of these athletes and turned it into the kind of products and services that you're having now. So if you maybe want to tell us a little bit more about what you're doing with that, who it's for, like what you're trying to accomplish, like all of those things.
Yeah, totally. I really appreciate that. So my most niche appeal program that I have is I built a 16-week program called Nordic Curl Now for people who like really want to master the Nordic curls and want some super in-depth coaching on that exercise in particular.
Nobody
So
better to hear it from.
yeah, hey, got to use world records when you get them, right?
Absolutely.
So that's there. That just launched recently. Super excited about that one. It also comes with mobility guides, a strength training guide, like kind of bonus stuff to work on. And then another one I'm really excited about is I'm working with another ATG coach named Maria Librano. We built a program called the College Soccer Accelerator, and this one is targeted towards ideally probably high school, maybe even middle school athletes or early college athletes who want to play college soccer, know that they have some performance improvements that they need or want, or maybe they've struggled with injuries in the past. And so we've adapted a lot of ATG principles and exercises that we've learned to target specifically to soccer players, because one of the biggest things we've figured out is, soccer basically turns you into a walking catalog of imbalances. It's almost inevitable. Like you're going to have better balance on your plant leg, better strength and mobility through the hips of your dominant striking leg, but more strength through the knee joint of your non-dominant leg. And all those things have consequences to how you move and your potential injury risk. So we have 6 months worth of programs in that program to take you through teaching you how to move. The first part's basically focused on doing everything possible to decrease your injury risk for concussions and ACL tears. And then we move into an imbalances phase, addressing imbalances phase, strength training phase. And then along the way, we have some bonus guides on conditioning, nutrition, mindset, footwear, like how to develop your weak foot, all these things like really specific to soccer players. So that's called the College Soccer Accelerator. Working on it with Maria. Recently launched that, and we're super excited about both of those things.
That's amazing, dude. It's like a one-stop shop essentially for that young kid, that middle school kid, that high school kid who's
Totally.
trying to make it, like,
That wants to play college soccer. It's she and
yeah.
I are considering it all the things we wished we knew, 15
Yeah.
years ago.
I do think about that so much of like how if I had all the tools and the skill sets that I have now, like
Yeah,
going back to that younger. And so that is so funny. That's always what we end up creating, right? Is the
for
things
sure.
that we wish we had when we were that younger selves. And
Definitely.
it's cool to
And
be able
it is really cool to be able to pass that on to the next generation, like
yeah,
awesome.
like none of the stuff that we went through and stuff like that was easy or enjoyable or something that we maybe wish on ourselves, but it does then become something that shapes you and allows you to help many, many more people than just yourself, like avoid or improve or whatever, like go through that situation that you had to go through.
Totally. And that reminds me, oh, printer's going crazy. I think it was a Sam Harris podcast once. He asked like every guest, what's something that you wouldn't want to go through again, but you're really glad that you did. And so for me, it was definitely the broken back, like 100%.
That's a great question. I like that. I like that. Like,
Yeah.
well, very cool, dude. Thank you very much for kind of taking the time to chat with us today about all of your Nordic exploits and your journey and everything like that. It's been a great conversation, and looking forward to catching up more soon, and definitely getting some footy in when I get out to Arizona.
Absolutely. And Zach, I really, really appreciate you having me on. This was a blast, and I really enjoyed talking to you.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine, man. We'll have to do it again soon.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks so much, Greg.
Take it easy.